Hello, everyone. Welcome back to EA Global. My name's Amy, and I am so excited to welcome you back to EA Global San Francisco after 3 years. It's actually been 5 years since we've been at the Palace of Fine Arts, and a lot has changed since then, except for this talk, which I'll be giving for, I think, my 11th time. So get ready to hear some things you may have heard before. So I'd like to challenge you to do 2 things at this event. 1, be open to changing your mind. If you notice that a speaker or a fellow attendee has an opinion that you think you disagree with, try to figure out how they came to that idea. So just be curious in the conversation. 2, think about your plans. So if you're considering a career move, starting a new project, there are a bunch of people here that can help you think about those plans. There's content that can influence your decision. So yeah, just try to think about the best use of time for you at this event. Some more advice for getting the most out of the conference. So prioritize one-on-ones. I've said it before, I'll say it again. People often meet their best friends, co-founders, collaborators at this conference. For example, I met at least half of my teammates as volunteers or attendees at EA Global. And this is going to be our largest event ever. I keep saying that, but it keeps being true. So make time for self-care. We have more than 1,500 people at this event, and that can be pretty overwhelming sometimes. I'm pretty extroverted, and I'd say if I go to one-on-one, 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 by the time I've done a handful in a row, it's kind of a blur. So this is not like a one-on-one having competition or something. I feel like I tell people prioritize one-on-ones, and then EAs are like, oh, that means just do as many as possible. That's not what I mean. I mean that the content's usually available online, the people are here, and you can get a lot out of meeting them. But sometimes the most important thing you can do is go take a nap or go for a beautiful walk or something. Because these one-on-ones are valuable, and they're most valuable when you're present and engaged with the person that you're talking to. These are really cool human beings that you can be curious about and engage with. So we do have a nap room, quiet working space, beautiful areas to walk around. Also, if you ever feel like you're having a hard time, for any reason, you're uncomfortable, you're feeling sad, Julia Wise is here. She's our community health point of contact, and the volunteers can help you find her, or you can contact her via swap card. So I'm so excited and grateful to the EA Global team and volunteers for all the work that they've done to make this possible. This year, we're on track to facilitate more connections in 1 year than every other year combined. Oh, thank you. Yeah, and we also have 75 volunteers wearing these blue shirts that you'll recognize. They're here to help you, so flag them down if you have a question or concern. So thank you all for coming, and welcome to EA Global San Francisco 2022. So a little change to the normal procedure. We are going to do the photo now. I think people have told you that. So I'm going to go down into the audience. They didn't tell you. The voice of God was supposed to tell you guys. Anyways, we're doing the photo now, so get excited. And Caitlin, our photographer, is going to come up and help you be in the photo. Scooching in is useful, so while I go down the stairs, if you can scooch towards each other, that would be handy. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be introducing our speakers for this opening fireside chat, Will and Toby. They sort of need no introduction, but I'll introduce them anyway. Will MacAskill is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Oxford, senior research fellow at the Global Priorities Institute, and advisor at the FTX Future Fund. He's the author of Doing Good Better, Moral Uncertainty, and his upcoming book called What We Owe the Future, which will hit the bookstores on August 16th, so get yourself a copy. Toby Ord is a senior research fellow in philosophy at Oxford University and author of The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity. His current research focuses on long-term trajectories for humanity and the risks which threaten to destroy our entire potential. Will and Toby together founded Giving What We Can in 2009, and both helped to establish the effective altruism movement. So please join me in welcoming Will and Toby. So Will, I know a thing you've been thinking a lot about recently is the idea of ambition. Maybe you could kick us off by talking about that.
Sure. So yeah, over the last year or so, I've been talking a bunch about culture of ambition, and in particular, the idea of kind of massively scalable projects. And so why have I been focusing on that? It's like two reasons. One is just that in general, impact is fat-tailed. So the people who do the very best within some field, I think have like really disproportionate impact compared to doing like okay or something. And so that's really clear within Earning to Give. You can just actually look at like how much do people earn in different paths. And it's very clear that like earnings are like this very fat-tailed distribution, especially when you're looking at entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. I think it's, evidence suggests it's true in research as well. I think it seems pretty clearly true when it comes to, say, politics as well. The president has this enormous, very disproportionate amount of power. And so if you're thinking just like, how should I act in a self-interested way? Well, going for a kind of like median-y outcome is like a pretty rational strategy, I think, because well, if I'm trying to get resources for myself, they have enormously diminishing returns. So if I'm a billionaire, having an extra $1 million like probably just doesn't make much difference. Whereas if you're acting altruistically, even if you're a billionaire, another $1 million is like huge. It's not that much difference compared to if you have nothing and have an extra $1 million. And so I think for altruistically minded people, you should take more seriously kind of aiming for like the far tails, the best possible success. So that's kind of like, so I think just in general, we should be like, when thinking about altruism, thinking like, okay, yeah, even if we are very likely to fail and actually achieve like very little, perhaps that's still the right strategy, because if you are getting a chance of a very, very good outcome. And that's unintuitive, so it's something we need to think about. The second aspect is that just now compared to the past, we, I think, really have the resources to take seriously that idea. So when Toby and I co-founded Giving What We Can, we were thinking like, how do we spend our donations? And that's like a few £1,000s or something. And the frame is like, okay, there are all these existing problems and in the world, there's all these existing organizations we could be donating to. We're making this tiny, tiny difference on the margin, and like, which should we decide? Which should we choose between? And the relevant frame is like cost effectiveness. What will have the most benefit for the money we have? Now we have like much greater financial resources for EA as a movement. And that means that instead, we've got to be thinking about, for example, setting up new projects. And when thinking about setting up new projects, it's not just, like, the benefit cost frame is, like, can be misleading, because if you can set up something that doesn't have as great benefit cost ratio as some of the best things we could be funding now, but is better than last dollar funding and is massively scalable, it can be like a better thing to set up than something that is less scalable but has a better kind of benefit cost ratio, because the total impact can be greater. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is thinking about the kind of shadow cost or opportunity cost of labor, where, again, when we kind of start giving what we can, we're just really thinking about benefit cost of money. Whereas now we're in this situation where it seems we're like, we've got this bottleneck of like very highly aligned EA labor. And in some areas, like in global health and development, Give Directly can just absorb huge amounts of funding without relying on like a scarce resource of labor. And we don't have anything like that really for anything within long-termism. And so that means I think there's really outsized rewards to creating projects that have the potential to scale massively with respect to funding without relying on labor, because that could be like better than our current last dollar. And in fact, like I think many projects, the main cost is actually the labor that goes into it rather than the financial costs. And so that's why I've been kind of pushing on this idea of what I was previously calling mega projects. Now I'm trying to move to massively scalable projects. And more generally on this idea of being judiciously ambitious.
Great. It would be great to hear from both of you, like, what kind of ambitions do you think that there are? And in what sense are we already ambitious, and in what sense could we be doing more?
So I actually agreed with every word of that. And I think, I've been thinking myself about these questions about ambition and also modesty or humility, and interesting tensions, or at least combinations of those things. And there are some aspects of a certain kind of modesty that in some ways was setting us back on some of these aspects, where, particularly in terms of valuing our own time and labor. So that was one aspect. Another thing is that a lot of the early thinking, which is still very relevant, as Will said, was thinking on the margins. And that's not a phrase that everyone knows what it means, but it means that there's already billions of dollars allocated to helping people in global poverty. So then it's not that you're doing the whole thing. You're thinking about, if I add another £1,000 to that, or $1,000, what will change? And that style of thinking is extremely valuable, and you can get things very wrong if you're not doing that, but you are making a marginal contribution, but you think you're doing everything. Because there's often these diminishing marginal returns, which means neglectedness is really important. But increasingly, we're not working on the margins. And so we need to be aware of which areas are we just doing something that's really quite big and new, and maybe there are increasing returns for a while until we reach a certain scale. So definitely keeping these things clear is really important. Another related aspect is that at the start, we were doing what I kind of think of as single-player altruism or something, where you take the world as it is, and then you say, well, with my life, with my years of time and my career, and also with my money, how can I make this change to it? And now it's more this multiplayer thing. If we've got a community of people, what's the portfolio of things that our community is doing, and then what's the best way to use that portfolio? And sometimes you can make changes that don't make sense on the margin because they're actually moving to somewhere different. And so we do need to increasingly think like that. In my case, when it comes to the ambition thinking, I've been thinking even more grandly about this, that there's something, the level of ambition with long-termism in particular is extraordinarily high. Like it's kind of wildly high by any.
Kind of harder to get higher.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's possible to get higher, really. But it's ultimately, when you get into it, thinking about the Earth could remain habitable for 1 billion years more, and that if we avoid dying now, then we could fill that time with wondrous things, flourishing lives. And even that's not the limit. There are billions of planets in our own galaxy and billions of galaxies that could be reached. And stars will be burning for trillions of years to come. And so there's these questions about all of that. And I think that sometimes it feels like we're like, I like to think about like a dust mote floating in a beautiful palace, and this kind of bacteria or something on the dust mote, and they mainly focus on their dust mote, but every now and then they look up and they see the beautiful palace and everything there, but they tend to never think about it, but it wouldn't be that surprising if this whole beautiful palace, something to do with what they could achieve, was out there. But we tend to look at very nice pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope or the James Webb, and then just forget all about it. So there is this level of just really grand ambition of not just to change the world in some nebulous way, but to actually substantively change the chance that we get to fulfill humanity's potential, as in that humanity gets to fulfill its potential, as opposed to as some kind of premature extinction event or similar. And this is just so far beyond the ambition of what other people are talking about. And there's something a bit alarming about that, or a bit strange, and that it's. I think it's when we think about culturally, how do we think about ambition? I think that usually it's associated, like it's. I don't know. The good guys are not normally that ambitious. It's normally the Bond villain, right, or something, who has these kinds of grand ambitions. If you think about when someone designs a kind of system like the Harry Potter houses or something, it's Slytherin that's the ambitious house or something. Like, people associate it with some kind of darkness or something. And I think that that's a mistake by the forces of goodness to not be ambitious enough and to leave it for others. And I think that when it comes, as you were saying, to individual ambitions, it kind of makes sense. Like after a while, you've got enough to have a very happy life with your family and to achieve the things you want. And it kind of doesn't make that much sense to keep trying to go after more. But when it comes to doing good, actually they're the people who should be ambitious. But the culture doesn't quite have that, and I think it could change. Yeah.
You spoke a bit about modesty at the start of that. So what kind of types of modesty do you think are commendable, and what types do you think might actually do more harm than good here?
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that's very interesting with this approach is that we combine this kind of aim to change the fundamental course of history, or at least to help inspire people to come together to make that change, and that this could be the most important thing in our time. But maybe we're wrong. I could be wrong about that. And that doesn't often come together with these ambitions. And I think that there's a certain kind of epistemic or humility, like the idea that you might be wrong, including also that you might be wrong about, we wrote this book on moral uncertainty. You might be wrong about the facts of the world, but also you might be wrong about the values that guide you, and it's worth taking seriously when someone else has a disagreement about this. And so I think there's this very unusual confluence of this kind of vaulting ambition, both on this kind of very grand abstract scale and also on the scale of projects that we're thinking of embarking upon, but combined with, we really want to find out if we're wrong about it, though. Or we want to help people, but we say in developing countries, but we really want to find out if the way we're trying to help them actually doesn't work, because then it would be a waste of our time. We should be doing something else. And there's this very unusual combination.
Yeah, and it relates to kind of one of the things that I am most worried about with the kind of like culture of ambition message is just like the types of personality you attract, where I think like it's an extremely good and like very important thing, like EA community at the moment of people who are like very like epistemically humble in general, and also kind of egoless, where it's like, okay, cool, Toby's just better at doing this thing than I am, so you should do it, even if it's like, a high status thing or something. And if instead we're attracting like ambition, and then maybe that attracts these like very male, very ego-full people. And like, I think that could be very bad. Like, if I think about how things could go at like AGI crunch time or something, like you could imagine it, maybe you want AI labs to merge or something, and someone just say, yep, okay, someone else should be like the leader of this organization. That's like quite a hard thing to do potentially. And like the kind of characteristic like entrepreneur, alpha male kind of thing is like maybe not actually like what we want. And so that's kind of tough, I think.
Another aspect is that in Will's thinking about these fat tails, as you said, and that the kind of impact that people have, they can be people who end up having 100 times more impact than the average. That's kind of often thought of, in this context, in a scale where it's like, there's a chance I make a lot of money or have this big impact, or maybe I don't do anything much or something. If there's also a chance that, not just that you get to zero, but you get to something negative, then that can change things. And especially if it's the case that what you do might damage the entire movement of people who are generating these projects. So if one had a plan that also had, the downside was a chance of destroying the whole movement or tarnishing it, irreparably, then that would be a big problem if people are taking on such, ambitious projects of that size.
Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, because I guess there's a risk of ambition being sort of encouraging unilateralist actions or something. So how might the effective altruism community be setting their sights too low, and where do you think we could afford to be more ambitious?
I think many ways. I'll just maybe highlight one, which is maybe not how people would naturally think of ambition, but in the context of research. I think people often have this idea of like, I'm a researcher, or I'm an academic, so I'm just going to add this little bit to the kind of overall cathedral of knowledge, and it's kind of someone else's job to aggregate it and put it all together. into like what should our all things considered like view of the world be. And so a question like, how likely is it that civilization might collapse this century? And if so, like, would we recover? And I think like for many people in the research mindset, certainly in academia, would just think, whoa, that's just way too big. Or like, okay, what is the probability of like existential risk from AI this century? And it's like, that's just this huge question. Like, I'm just gonna answer this little bit of it. But it means that like the number of people who are really targeting the most actionable questions for decision makers like Future Fund, Open Philanthropy, it's like 4 or something. It's like really small. And so I'll maybe highlight one thing that's like addressing this. So Leopold Aschenbrenner is building what he's calling a grand unified cost effectiveness model. But the idea is just like you have some project. It is this model that you put in like what's the project doing for basically anything. That's the kind of ultimate aim. And then it will say like how good it is in terms of benefits and costs. And taking into account all sorts of parameters like AI existential risk, civilizational collapse and recovery, like values and so on. And then you can like put in your own parameters if you disagree with like the assumed parameters. And that's just this like extraordinarily ambitious research project, but I'm like, this is exactly the thing that like the key decision makers need. So
I think that's a great answer.
I mean, yeah, I think that would be just so relevant for decision makers, and I guess would pull in a lot of knowledge that's sort of being done in the community right now.
Yeah.
So Toby, you touched on this already a bit, but what are some of the downsides you're both most worried about from aiming really high?
Yeah, I mean, what I said before, really, that it's particularly risks, not just that you fall to the ground, but that you bring other things crashing down. And there's also this issue that some of my colleagues at FHI have talked about, the Unilateralists Curse, which comes up there, which is, the idea is it's a bit like the winner's curse, if people have heard of that at auctions, where the person who gets high enough to win the bids of the auction is probably the person who overestimated the value of the thing that they're getting. And similarly, you can get that if there's a bunch of people who could do something, say some grand project, but they're not doing it. You might think they're not being ambitious enough and they're making some kind of failing, but it could be that they think there's also some serious costs to it or chances of it bringing other things down. And that's the reason. And that if you're the only person who steps forward to do it, like conditional upon no one else doing it, maybe that's because you all had, somewhat inaccurate estimates of these things, and you were the person who had the most optimistic estimates. So I do think that that's a kind of concern, but also, I mean, there are ways to overcome that. And they include, for example, talking to the other people who could have done it but have chosen not to, and finding out why. And the answer could be they're doing other things, or that they think it's too hard. And so there are ways to overcome it. That shouldn't just be an excuse for not reaching high, but it also, I think, is a useful frame for thinking about these challenges.
Yeah, I think on the obviously, I strongly agree with unilateralism, and it's again something that I think is important kind of culture of not checking with other people is my model of things totally off. I think I do worry that in the past, I think this is just actually much less true now. I think there's been a much stronger kind of cultural response to this message than I expected. But I think in the past, people were very scared, in EA, and it's kind of I don't want to be unilateralist, so I'm just not going to do anything. And it was almost people were so afraid of potentially causing harm or doing something that they weren't willing to take action, even if it really was the case. The lesson of the Unilateralist Curse is take all the people thinking about this. Who's the person in the middle? The middle view is the one that's kind of right. I felt sometimes people were oh, if anyone objects, I just shouldn't do it. Yeah. And I actually think that now we've kind of moved, even just in the last 6 months, in this more kind of calibrated direction, I think.
Yeah, my colleagues who kind of introduced this idea, they did this complicated Bayesian analysis of in this unilateralist curse situation, how should you act given your priors over how everyone else is kind of forming their beliefs about how, how valuable this thing is or how risky it is. And then they also thought, what if you just vote on it? Yeah. And it turns out that just voting on it is almost as good. Yeah. Which is the same as taking the middle person's opinion if you lined them all up. Yeah. And so, yeah, the answer to it is talk to the other people, not don't do the thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then I'll mention a couple other worries, again, from seeing how people have responded. So I think one thing is just like people kind of somewhat like pretending to be ambitious or something, but like not really having a clear plan. So sometimes with like the applications that came in for Future Fund, you could kind of tell it was like the same application, but on the budget they'd added a 0 at the end. And it's like, well, this is going to be like very wasteful. A second thing is like thinking, oh, I want to be ambitious, so you start off with some enormous thing. Whereas really like, this is why I prefer the like massively scalable term, is like, you might be starting small. Maybe you're starting your budget as like $10,000 a year, but it's something that can scale like to a very great degree. And that's important because early on you want to be nimble, you want to be learning a lot. If you're immediately like starting off with this like billion-dollar thing, then like probably you're going to end up like this horribly bloated like bureaucratic thing. And then the final thing is like disappointment as well, where the lesson, the fat-tailed impact lesson is like you aim for the best thing and you probably fail. And so similarly, it's like we want to have loads of massively scalable project ideas, and we're probably going to fund like ultimately like almost none of them. And that's like hard to be in the like mental mode of. And so there's definitely a worry about just like in the nature of things, people like oh, but we're talking about like being really ambitious and I have these plans and it's like not working out. And secondly, in terms of just like the environment changes, our information changes, like the funding landscape changes, where like, again, over the last 6 months, like markets are down a lot. It's been a crypto crash, so, we still have a lot of financial resources, but like less than we did 6 months ago. It's hard to like have all of those considerations in mind. Like entrepreneur types are normally like horrifically over-optimistic. And maybe that's how you need to be, but it also could lead to like a lot of disappointment.
Just to press on this, I guess, a little bit more, are there any kind of outright failure modes or some concrete scenarios where you think things could go pretty badly wrong?
Yeah, I guess one of my concerns would be political partisanship. So this is something I wrote in the precipice that in kind of what not to do. I have a little section, and one of my concerns is about if any of the big ideas that we're discussing here this weekend, whether that be about existential risk or just generally considering the long-term future or effective altruism or itself, or I guess with global poverty and animal welfare, they're somewhat more established already. They've kind of set their own trajectories. But if these kind of get seen as like a left issue or a right issue, then I think that there's a big problem. So if you look at environmentalism in the US, the history is very interesting. There's this great Ronald Reagan quote about it being not a left issue or a right issue, but an everyone issue. And in fact, in a lot of ways, it's naturally a conservative concept. It's, conservation and conservatism are very linked words. But it ended up becoming more of a left issue. And whereas before that, the two parties were competing to win over the environmentalist voters, right? And then we got the situation where they weren't competing and in fact were trying to block the things. And so I think that the best situation is where everyone's competing to win over the people who care about it. Maybe the second best is that it's just such an obvious issue that it's kind of in the background and policymakers and regulators are trying to work to try to help these things, and no one even needs to discuss it. But then below that is some issue where one side is not interested, and below that is an issue where they're even fighting it, or in fact below that it's just toxic and no one even wants to touch it, and everyone's distancing themselves. But I think that we should be careful with those questions.
Yeah, I mean, concrete failure mode is just like, for me, is just negative impacts on culture where, especially I can imagine like implicitly what's get rewarded is like flashiness or like you doing some like really big thing, but like I always want the key thing to be like what's most impactful. And like I feel this viscerally in my own life as well, where it's like, oh, it could be like running this like big thing, big organization, or like grant making or something, or it's like sitting in a dressing gown with a cup of tea, like working on some like philosophy issue or something. Like that latter thing can be better than the former. Especially given how little we know. And we really want to have a culture where what is getting rewarded is like the expected impact you're having rather than like, certainly not like how many employees do you have.
Great. So, Will, you mentioned the kind of change in resources over the last 6 months. So there has been a significant crypto crash. It's been the worst 6 months performance of the stock market since 1970. We have less resources in the community than we did 6 months ago. How should that change how we're thinking about ambition?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's like a few updates. So I mean, one thing to bear in mind is like we still have enormous like financial resources like compared to what we were thinking about kind of a few years ago. But there's definitely like a couple of things. I think the number one biggest is like aligned, like interested but not like super aligned like EA donors, where one of the things I was really thinking about, about a year ago was like, man, there are these like, especially on the long-termist side, like potentially interested donors, and they're like, what can we even fund? Like, I want to give, but what can we even fund? And I was just worried about like such donors like bouncing off because they're like, well, there's just nothing to fund in this area. And so things that could absorb a lot of money actually like, they could even end up being like net positive financially because they're like a way of bringing in other donors. One thing you find like during the sessions is that like certainly outside of EA community, like donors like freeze up a lot more. And so I think like that argument is like quite a bit weaker than it was. A second thing is just like in some areas, but certainly on the FTX side, like near-term cost of capital is like a lot higher. Like effective interest you can get, or rate of return is like much higher. And so that means like really big expenditures in like the next 6 months like look like a less good deal. And then like a little bit of a mood, like somewhat mood difference of not like go super big now. That being said, like the idea of like set up projects that can scale massively, like it's still going to be really important. Like we still have like many tens of billions of dollars of capital that we want to spend as effectively as possible. And that's still like the key thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an opportunity to learn some lessons of humility on this. I guess we'll see what happens with crypto as to whether it is one of these things where it recovers, or whether it's had its highest moments. But I think that the people who are earning money in this way, or with other aspects of the stock market and tech stocks, they know that these things go up and down, and that they can come down, and people have been, have kind of already had that in mind, and this is part of the expected landscape of possibilities. So there are people who aim big, but yeah, I think a lot of them have already kind of learned this lesson or something. That there's part of the challenge, I guess, in those cases, if something does go up and might come down, is to know how much to kind of go all in on it, and how much to kind of continually withdraw and bank some of the gains. People seem to have actually been pretty good at that in the community, as far as I know. Yep.
And like you said, even if people have ideas for really scalable projects, it might be that their year one budget is like 10K or 50K.
Yeah. Or like it's more than that, but it's not like
a billion.
Yeah, it's a billion. I think it's like a very unlikely scenario where like someone wants to start off at that level, and that makes sense rather than starting smaller, scaling up.
Great. So in terms of ideas for really ambitious projects you'd like to see, are there any that are top of mind?
One that I'm really keen on is like far UVC. So Kevin Esvelt has been like really promoting this. So the idea is like UV light is known to kind of sterilize like the air or a room. So just kills off pathogens. Issue with UV light in general is like it's also carcinogenic for humans. However, like specific type of UV light, UVC, seems to be safe, in fact, yet has the sterilizing properties. At the moment, it's very expensive to create light bulbs that have that emit that light. It's like $1,000 per bulb. But perhaps with investment, we could get that way down, like $10, even $1 per bulb. And so you could imagine it's just like part of regulation, like part of building codes, that this sort of light has to be implemented in. Am I still? Okay, yeah. This type of light just has to be implemented like in all houses, like maybe in just like most countries in the world. If so, then like we would make an enormous difference to the like probability of a worst case pandemic happening, while at the same time like eradicating most of the respiratory disease. I'm like, man, that's pretty good. Yeah. And it's like all like, and the kind of early signs, like you don't want to get like too confident, optimistic, but like the early signs are like, this could just really work. And that's like, I don't know, that's like pretty exciting to me.
Yeah, I'd been thinking about a similar thing there in terms of, in wake of this kind of warning shot of, that we've had with COVID, I guess it's interesting. If it had peaked, over a few months and then gone away, like suppose we didn't have the variants and so we reached herd immunity to the original variants, maybe we would have been able to learn more from it. It kind of carried on long enough that it became a culture war issue, and so it's been a bit harder, particularly in America, to kind of decide to, to keep talking about it. Basically, I think the voters want to talk about anything else, so there's a challenge there. But to the extent to which we still can learn these lessons and have it on the agenda, there's I think a kind of a vision of thinking that a century or two ago we got rid of waterborne diseases in our cities, through sanitation, and that this was huge, and evidence-based attempts to improve the future. And could we do something like that with airborne diseases? And one of the approaches, I mean, learning from the history actually would be pretty interesting, of kind of sewer connections and people getting kind of toilets and so forth for their houses, that as to, did that require government intervention, or was it just that you offered the things and that they're sufficiently exciting that people take them up? If you think about, say, the efforts to subsidize thermal insulation for people's walls and roofs, or solar panels on people's roofs, there are these techniques, or more efficient boilers or heat pumps for houses. There are these approaches of subsidy and then also of changing building codes, or saying that in 20 years' time it will be illegal to sell a house that doesn't have, say, this air purification system. And it feels like just using, to some extent this is unambitious, right? It's like using the standard infrastructure we've used for a whole lot of other policy choices to meet this ambitious goal of kind of getting rid of airborne disease. And I think that, one could look at this. When I was looking into it, I was thinking about air filtering and ventilation, and there are some good answers on that. But it does seem like some of these technologies, like the UVC, may go quite a bit beyond that and are equivalent to a very large amount of ventilation, especially in some places, some workplaces in particular, you can't really quite solve it with ventilation. So I think that there is room and a very approachable political movement or something like that to say, let's do for airborne diseases what we've done for waterborne diseases.
Yeah. And then, I've also just been, like, again, in terms of like cultural response here, like really impressed by how some ideas for massively scalable projects just have been put into place. Like, I was really keen on this, like taken by this fact that like in, just poor countries across the world, they're like incredibly morally motivated, talented young people who like never have an opportunity to like, or have very limited opportunities to like really kind of contribute in the world because they're just stuck in their kind of low-income environment. And yet at the same time, we have these like huge problems that we just need more like morally motivated, talented people. And so like, can we just try and find those people, give them scholarships, give them like introduction to these ideas? And the Atlas Fellowship is like, been like aiming to do that. A second thing was like participant media, which is this like, basically like movie production company. So like the film Contagion, that was like a socially motivated production by this company, Participant Media, like, oh, maybe we could do the same, and like commission documentaries, TV shows, movies, where, the win state is that you're like making like close to like market return anyway, so it's actually very cheap once you've got sufficient capital, but yet you're having this like really positive cultural impact. And that also, like, again, extremely early stages, but is going ahead. So Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Natalie Cargill are kind of, working to set up a production studio there. So like one thing I've just been like really impressed by how much people have like kind of heard this message and are like, yeah, we're going to do it. So.
And as we think about kind of effective altruism growing and say it becomes more mainstream, are you worried that EA kind of becomes less weird, or like we lose the kind of more unusual aspects that inform our thinking? Or are you worried about putting people off in the first place by having these kind of unusual ways of thinking?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a good question, because I think that there's different ways in which this kind of weirdness can manifest. So I think that what's particularly valuable and kind of striking about this group of people and this group of ideas is that the ideas often are rooted in actually pretty solid things, right? If anything, boringly solid things about if it matters to cure one person of blindness, it matters 10 times as much to cure 10 people of blindness. And people say, well, okay, sure. But then, quite dramatic things start to follow from this about what we should be doing. And so the conclusions of some of our ideas are unusual and initially strike people as strange as to, is the big issue of our time, protecting humanity from these existential risks? This is not what a lot of people think it is, the big issue is. And so I think that there's a lot of unusualness there, and there is potentially a pressure to, in attempting to kind of like polish off the rough edges or to reach wider audiences, that we lose some of that. But by the same token, though, there's also a lot of weirdness on a kind of more personal level, or that we have unusual ideas, social ideas and things, or come up with kind of our own new conventions for how to do things that we think are better than the old conventions. And then that we turn people off with kind of cliquishness or other aspects there. And so I think there's this idea of weirdness points. And I would say that we want to use those on the ideas which we think are essential or at least transformative to humanity's future, not on the slightly superior forms of new social conventions that we've developed because we thought they were a bit better, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, in terms of, I think one thing I think quite strongly is like, ideas don't really have intrinsic weirdness or not, and people make mistakes by thinking about that, because there's just like 1,000 ways to present the same idea. So if you're talking about long-termism, one way you can go is the like, classic Bushlomian, like, okay, this is how many lives that could be simulated with all of like solar light in the accessible universe, and even a like 1 in a billion chance of like 10 to the 50 lives is like worth it. That's like a particularly like unfortunate presentation, I think, and the argument like really doesn't need it. And instead it could be like, look, do you care about your grandkids? And like, do you care about your grandkids? And like, okay, like expand from there. So there's like a lot of ways into the kind of same idea, and they maybe have different resonances. I think the second thing is like, that is tough, and I don't actually have great solutions to it, is just like, as the community grows and becomes a lot more public, it's like, harder to have kind of like freewheeling intellectual discussions, sort of thing like you find in a moral philosophy seminar room, and like, I don't know, you defend a view and it's like, but you don't endorse the view or something, or you're like exploring space. Like, it's very nice to not be able to have to think like, oh, maybe there's a journalist listening in who'll then just like take some of these quotes out of context or something. And on the EA forum, like journalists now just do read it or even participate. And that does mean that like, it's just much harder to have like, you've got to like think about what you're saying, like how could this be perceived if a quote was taken out of context or something? And that's tough, that sucks.
Yeah, that's a funny one. I do think that there is a certain, sacredness or something about like the philosophy tutorial room, or probably even going back to ancient Greece, right? Where you're allowed to kind of try out ideas and things. It's a bit like a kind of relationship, with your doctor or your therapist or something. And people try out things, and then they say, "Oh yeah, I guess it was wrong." Wouldn't that have this crazy conclusion? You're like, "Oh yeah, I guess it does." And you can kind of move more quickly by trying out ideas and then testing them. But I remember when I was studying philosophy, this is not an EA example, but a journalist wanted to come along to a philosophy conference that my lecturer was doing. And they were talking about the other possible worlds semantics for counterfactuals, which some levels kind of interesting, some levels pretty boring. And they were saying, oh yeah, we're basically saying there's a world in which each of the possible events happens. And so any kind of thing could have a possible world. For example, there's a world where people are walking around with a piece of toast on their head, because that's something we could possibly do. And then there was this expose that these taxpayer-funded philosophers
God.
were debating whether or not there is worlds where people have pieces of toast on their head, and so on. And
This is particularly funny because like I also have a story about an argument between philosophers about modal logic, where two philosophers I know they were in a taxi, and so modal claims are like if X were to happen, then Y would happen. But one of them chose to have the antecedent, if I were to stab the taxi driver, then, and she got kicked out the taxi. So just for context, like philosophers really don't think about how what they're saying might be received, even in the audience of a taxi cab. So it's definitely a worry for the broader conversations we might have.
Don't be that person.
Yeah.
That's definitely the lesson.
So thinking about best case scenarios now. So imagine a best case scenario for long-termism, where ideas have kind of like been communicated in ways you think are ideal. Like what do you see and what kind of outcomes should we hope for?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm thinking about like the kind of best case kind of cultural influence, I actually tend to think more about effective altruism as a whole rather than long-termism, where, and this relates to the idea of ambition as well, where for many years, we've had this idea of like, effective altruism is to the pursuit of good what the scientific method is to the pursuit of truth. Mm-hmm. And in the course of writing What We Are the Future, I just learned a lot about like why did the Industrial Revolution happen, like what was going on there. And I'm pretty convinced actually that the main thing was like a cultural change. Like I think actually there was lots of factors, but the biggest thing was that like Western Europe developed this kind of culture of innovation. And that's this like pretty wild thing, like, the biggest event that like ever happened in history was like the underlying thing was just this like cultural change of like what was rewarded, what was it like socially acceptable or even like promoted to do. And so I kind of think of like the huge win state for EA as being like that, like actually being like a cultural change on the size of like the culture of innovation that led to the Enlightenment, to the scientific revolution, to the Industrial Revolution, and then getting taken seriously in the same way as, all around the world, the idea that like, if you want to pursue truth, then you use like approximately the methods of science is like very, very normal. Mm-hmm. You could have that in the same way as like, if you want to do good, you think impartially, you look from the point of view of the universe, you use evidence and careful reasoning to try to do that, and you take a cooperative approach with respect to other people. I think like if we get there, like I'm feeling very good about the world and about the future. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I've been thinking about in terms of very big but somewhat concrete kind of wins, as opposed to just having a great future or something. About existential security, as I call it, where there are a bunch of different existential risks that we face, and a lot of the conversation has been about taking a particular risk and trying to reduce it, and to become safe from it. But there will be more risks to come. And if you imagine a situation where there's a certain amount of risk each century as new things keep getting developed, if you solve all of the risk in your century, you have a substantial impact. Suppose there was a 10% risk each century, and you get rid of it in your century. The impact you have ends up being about 10% of the value of a century. But it doesn't end up being saving the long-term future because there's still only going to last about 10 centuries on average if we keep having this amount of risk. Whereas if you could do something that lowered the risk in all centuries, then it would start to have this really transformative impact. And so I think we need to be doing both. We need to be fighting fires, but also kind of building a fire brigade, or setting up government so that we decide, we just really can't accept, say, big fires in San Francisco or in London or something, and can learn from that and develop their housing codes or whatever in this case. So I think that this involves reaching a point where nation states accept that there's a certain kind of limit on their sovereignty or a certain kind of, effectively through treaties with others, that it's illegitimate to impose existential risk, and that we're just going to have to be a bit patient when it comes to certain kinds of technologies that could pose those risks. And I feel that that is quite doable. It's not really doable in 20 years, but if you only have to go back I guess, it was 76 years or something, and there was no UN. Go back, 100 years or 102 or something, and there had never even been a League of Nations or any real attempt to actually have a world polity agreeing on anything. And so what would happen in another 100 years? I think that things like this are certainly on the table.
So I guess the idea of sort of being ambitious and doing good in the world is to lead to these good outcomes. And you two are two of the people who thought the most about how the very long future could go. Can you guys clarify what you mean by the kind of long reflection? And it'd be nice to move to that kind of philosophical discussion that I think was kind of quite big in discussion a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I can say a bit on
sure,
this.
go
I find this is one of our most misunderstood ideas.
I'd agree with
almost everyone misunderstands it, and to a level where I'm quite surprised. They normally say, "I really dislike your idea. It's actually terrible. In fact, or maybe stupid. Either stupid or immoral or something idea. Instead, you should do this." And I'm like, "Oh, that's the thing I was talking about." So it's a little bit frustrating. We've clearly failed at communication here. So one way I think about it is that if you go back at least as far as, say, the ancient Greeks, Socrates or earlier, there's been a kind of discussion about how we should live our lives and what matters politically and ethically. And this conversation has at times been, between philosophers or writing books and things like that, or journal articles. But also there's been, other visionaries, such as Martin Luther King or others who have been taking different ideas and fighting with them, or the suffragists in England and the people fighting against the slave trade, who've been making moral progress in various ways. And what I'm saying is that we've had, at least 2,500 years of that, and we're probably going to need like 2,500 years or more of it to come. And it would be unprecedented if we were to just stop that and to say, we're done, we've got the right thing, let's kind of indoctrinate that into future generations and not let them debate it, or something along those lines, and lock it in. And I'm saying, don't do that. Instead, continue to have this kind of debate. It may be that you can do better and add some additional structure to it compared to just totally free-form things. But I'm not imagining it will be just like some kind of philosophy seminar that goes on for thousands or millions of years until everyone finishes the task, or that it would only be philosophers, or that it's what everyone would be thinking about. And so an analogy I give in the precipice when I talk about it is to the Enlightenment or to the Renaissance, that these are time periods. It's not like everyone was making sculptures and kind of rediscovering ancient texts or developing new systems of government, but that's what the times are known for. And so I think that ultimately the role that the time period would be serving in the big picture, really big picture history of humanity would be continuing to really kind of work things out before we make any irreversible changes. So we could all have the new iPhone or something. I think I've been criticized of saying that we'd just absolutely lock in like 2022 technologies or something, and everyone would do it because some philosopher said so. Instead, the idea is that it's not because I say so, it's because I think it's a good idea. And so we would be doing it if we think it's a good idea. And it would involve being cautious about irreversible changes and being cautious about locking in moral value systems for all time. And then also another aspect of it is saying some people get, when they think about existential risks or they think about artificial intelligence, they're thinking, well, if we develop this AI, then what kind of utopia would we be choosing to get? And I think, well, that's the wrong way to look at it. You'd want to take some time and also have a legitimate process that led to that choice. And so what we'd want is to have a period of some kind of safety and stability that I call existential security, in which we can no longer lose the game. And then it's kind of, the future is ours to lose at that point. And at that point, we can take our time to work out like how best to use that future. So that's how I see the idea, which I think is like just not that controversial, really.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add to that. Sometimes people think of it as a description, a prediction about what will happen, and that's like never what the intention was. Instead, it's like an ideal. And yeah, as Toby says, like the key thing is like there might be these moments of lock-in. It's like very hard to make change afterwards. So formation of a world government, space settlement, might be these moments where like what you go out and do, it's like hard to change. And so the analogy is like, imagine you're kind of a young person, you're about to embark on your career, but now suppose that like how much time should you be thinking about like, what career do you pursue? But now imagine like, once you start, you can't like change. So it's a decision for all time. And then secondly, also just that your career is going to last 1,000,000 years. And it's like, okay, you're going to really think about this decision before you go and do it. And that's the kind of just key idea of the long reflection as well, is like, there are certain things that might happen that will be irreversible. Let's just like push that kind of into the future a little bit. Your description of kind of enlightenment gave me a thought just there, which was like, we have had this moment of lock-in in the past of the colonial era where, would things have gone better if in like Western Europe they thought, well, I mean, obviously they just didn't actually even know that they were like discovering a whole new continent. But if they thought like, oh, we should really be, if they had known like, we should really be thinking about what might happen when we're like now unifying the entire world and like bringing like totally different set of diseases and culture and institution and like to this whole new continent, like what ways that could go very badly. And I think obviously well-known ways in which it did go very badly, and like that was a moment of like cultural lock-in, I think.
It is interesting, as there were a lot of very bad aspects about how that happened, both in terms of what happened and also the choices. Like some of it was clearly bad at the time.
Yeah.
But it's actually quite hard to see how to do it well.
Yep.
If you have a situation where there are different diseases in each place, and once they mix, as many as 90% of the people in one of those kind of world zones might die, what on earth do you do? Do you try to decide no one can ever cross the Atlantic?
Yeah.
I don't know what you do. It'd be a fascinating counterfactual historical novel of some really well-meaning people trying to actually meet their brethren across the sea in as good a way as possible.
Yeah. Or maybe, another analogy perhaps as well is formation of the United States, where, the US wins the War of Independence. Like, what could they have done? George Washington could have said, like, I'm dictator now. This is how things are going to be. Instead, what happened is, like, the leading intellectual figures from like all the states got together and they sat and debated like what should the Constitution of the United States be for like, and it's for 3 months. I mean, it's like absurd how actually like short this was. But like that's still better. Like we've got on one hand George Washington saying he's dictator. It's like worst case. Philadelphia Convention, like 3-4 months of like debating this and like formatting a set of rules was like much, much better. Maybe it could have been 5 months. Maybe that would have been better again, given that the U.S. Has already lasted like over 200 years.
And there are examples of these founders thinking seriously about the centuries that could come and feeling the weight on their shoulders about making these decisions.
I mean, this was known. Like John Adams has this great quote of like, the institutions now made in America will not wear out wholly for thousands of years, and if they go wrong, they won't return except by accident to the right path. It's therefore of the last importance that they be made right. And it's actually a good case of like someone taking long-term thinking seriously.
Exactly, and showing that it's not that weird actually. It's like, it's a kind of sober, wise decision made by a person being very careful there, and that I actually think that the founding of America, which I've had reason to think about due to Hamilton, of course, those of us who are not ourselves Americans. It's interesting as a kind of analogy for how I think about existential security and the long reflection. Something like this, but at a global level. Not in the case of founding a giant one-country world thing. I don't think that would be a good idea. I think that would enhance other risks. But rather trying to kind of come together to set the parameters by which, what are the boundaries by which we think we should never cross? What are the things we think we should rule out? But then subject to 2/3 majority changing of those if we decide we'd got it wrong, or something like that. But then also, what are the structures we're going to set up? The kind of procedural system, such that we hope to actually, we don't want to lock American values of that, proto-American values in forever in aspic. They instead wanted to create a flourishing conversation. And so things like free speech norms are a bit like this long reflection idea, where it's like, how do we set things up so that all voices will be heard? and so that the good ideas win out over the bad ideas. And so that even though we don't know what those ideas or values are at the moment, that we can kind of set up a system procedurally in a way that's seen also transparently to be fair to people of all different views, and to set that rolling forwards. So I think that, you know, what we're suggesting on this grander level is actually not that different in character.
Mm-hmm. So if we make it through this time of existential risks, should we expect to just naturally converge on what the kind of best possible values in the long run should be? Or do you expect a lot of variation in how good the future could turn out to be?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think there might be really quite a lot of variation. So even if we do kind of reduce certainly extinction risks, but even like kind of worse kind of misaligned AI risks to zero, nonetheless, like things really might be quite contingent depending on kind of what values are predominant at the time and what are people trying to choose to do. Where part of that is, I think, like the best kind of, what really is the best outcome might be like quite a narrow target, and it also might be like quite alien, quite unusual. So kind of analogy is like, how weird is quantum mechanics to like Aristotle? Mm-hmm. Maybe that's how weird like the right model view is to us today or something. Mm-hmm. And if that's right, then like maybe it just doesn't happen like as a matter of default. Mm-hmm. And instead, like if we have the long reflection, I'm like feeling really good about that. But if we don't, and it's more like, you know, just like something of like a kind of competition for power, then like the future we get, I think, at least could plausibly be like losing out on almost all value that we could have otherwise achieved.
Yeah, so I think this is actually an area where, in some ways, there's some of the most substantive disagreement between Will and I. Yeah. Although I think we at least agree about what the disagreement is. So, like with the idea of existential risk, it's kind of predicated on simplifying things. So in some sense, you know, we maybe care about the expected value of the future or something like that. It's very hard to determine, a very complex kind of thing. Think about all the different pathways. But if there are things that could, you know, if it turns out that empirically, the worlds that we're going to end up in are either ones that get most of the value we could have ever achieved, say, let's say more than 90% of our full potential, or worlds where we have less than 10%, let's say between minus 10% and plus 10% of our full potential, then it's not such a bad approximation to just ask which of these buckets do we end up in, then you can just measure it by the probability. You don't have to do the probability times the values. It simplifies the thinking a lot, and you could just talk about how much existential risk is created. That's the idea there. If it turns out that model's kind of wrong, and that instead of having one kind of spike of probability nearish to zero and one near the maximum, that actually there's a whole lot in the middle, then the idea of existential risk is just less useful. So I think that it's a very useful conversation to have, and I could be wrong about my view. My view is that it is more like these two peaks. And so I think of this because there's this question, we've got a long future ahead of us. And so there's this question, if we do get locked into a bad set of moral views, which could even be like the sets that we currently think are the best moral views, right? If they turn out to be, as Will was saying, substantially worse than what we could achieve, but we lock them in somehow, then that is an existential catastrophe, the locking in of these incorrect moral views. But if it's not locked in, and we've got millions of years, maybe billions of years of conversation, and that's millions of centuries, like why doesn't it trend somewhere better, given that there's all of this ability to have conversation about it and so on. And so that's kind of my general thinking, is that the truth of a view is exerts some kind of pressure, right? You tend to do a bit better in arguments if your view is true, because the kind of things that support it work better, and your opponent, there are kind of ways to attack them on the falsity of their argument that you've got access to. So long as you can set up a neutral enough playing field about other things than truth, you can kind of get some convergence towards the truth. And I would hope that over a long enough time, there's a kind of basin of attraction of starting points that will kind of veer towards the best outcome. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. But I know in some other conversations with Will, like he suggested some ways in which this could be wrong, and it's not just that you could lock in things towards the bottom, but you could get things in the middle.
Yeah.
Do you want to mention any of them? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots to say. I mean, one thing is just that, like, I think that the kind of, if we've got this situation of like millions or billions of years of conversation and so on, like, I'm also like feeling pretty good about that. Kind of in two ways, actually. One is just, okay, maybe in general we trend. Or secondly, just, you know, supposing resources are just like equally distributed among everyone in the world. And most people aren't kind of morally motivated. And it turns out there's no convergence there. They don't end up morally motivated. But some are, even just 1% are. And they really care about doing the right thing. And you've got opportunities for trade. Potentially the gains there are just like really huge, where potentially both sides can get like 90% of what they want, or even 99% of what they want. That's like, you know, quite promising. However, I guess I'm like at least more pessimistic or more worried that we do get that like long amount of conversation where, I don't know, if we look at history, that kind of feels like something like egalitarian, liberal, democratic culture, institutions kind of persisting for a very long time. And then if we look at history, actually like the normal social structure is like much more hierarchical, like even authoritarian. And it does seem to me that kind of like egalitarian, liberal democracies, like it's certainly very much helped by the very particular technological mode we're in, where on one hand, like we have guns, like, and that actually is like very equalizing in terms of like military power. You know, if you imagine like a future where it's like, oh, I'm the dictator and I have like an automated army and automated police force.
This is one of those philosophy thought experiments to not say in a cab.
Yeah. I'm not a dictator. You know, then that like underlying like distribution of power, like actually, you know, you can quite plausibly think you could have like massively more concentration of like military power.
But wouldn't that be an existential catastrophe then, if they locked that in?
Well, then there's just at least this like question of like how bad, and I think this is true for like, yeah, like some like authoritarian future or something, like how bad is that compared to, you know, the best possible future? I think that just like, in the community at least, like a genuine kind of range of views, where, you know, if you think, we're gonna get a little more technical, but if you think it's like value is bounded, and so it's not like, you know, you may be relatively quickly get to like close to the best possible future, then like perhaps something, even if it's like somewhat dystopian, you're still achieving like half as much as you could have achieved. That's like, I mean, it's not my view, but it's like at least a view you could have. Yeah. Even on futures where like AI, like misaligned AI is the kind of takes over, some people like Paul Cristiano suggests that's like half as good as the kind of like human future. So again, then like misaligned AI wouldn't count as an existential catastrophe, but I certainly want to be really worried about that.
Yeah.
And again, like maybe.
I'm just going to jump in and wrap up in the interest of time. I mean, this.
Yeah.
I'm sure this conversation could go on for an hour. So it's
Well,
a
we
shame.
are doing an office hours after this.
Yes.
As well. So
Yeah,
if
exactly.
people just, you know, can't get enough of this.
Yeah.
You can get more.
So I think I'll end on a kind of more personal question of, yeah, is there anything that the other person has done in the last year that you're really impressed by or think is really valuable, or what's something you really admire about the other person?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think like many things. But in general, I think I've just been really impressed by like Toby's inroads with like, you know, politics and policy, and then like the UN in particular. Toby seems to have like a natural like ability to like work with the kind of political establishment certainly I don't have, and I just think it's like generating enormous amounts of value.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that you do have it. I think that the key is that there's a way of doing it that's surprising, but if you say clear and useful things that explain the issue and kind of lay it out, they're like, they really listen. They're like, oh my God, no one else was doing this. They were just waffling about the thing that their pre-existing kind of organization they'd set up.
Yeah.
And so actually, I think philosophers have the skill to do this, and it's easier than you'd think. But I guess in your case, I admire the kind of boundless energy that you have and bring to things, kind of continuing, and you've got like so many different plates that you're spinning in the air or something, and so you managed to keep them all spinning, and I'm impressed.
Cool. Well, that's a very sweet note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Please join me in thanking Will and Toby.